anyway, without further ado, we'll turn time over to Tony Spencer, who will be presenting today.
Okay. Again, apologies for last week. I was definitely under the weather, but I'm here today. I'm not 100%, so I'll do the best that I can, and it could be interesting again. We're going to do some live coding, so I hope things will turn out, but we'll see. But before we dive into that, I wanted to go over, I have some slides here. Let's see if I can start the slideshow. We'll go through these really briefly. Today we want to talk about ASP.NET, WebAPI, and web services. And because it's kind of foundational, oh, I forgot about this slide too. This is where you can find us, by the way. You can find us on Slack and Yammer and Integration Point. And then if you have any questions, Michael Gibby, send all your questions to him. And then he'll route them back to us. So it'll be great. And we're on the second floor on the south side, so you can come visit us. Be happy to see you. All right. Okay, today's agenda, do some real brief introduction to architecture, a slight overview of REST. I don't want to get into that too deeply. And then we're going to do code from that point on. So real quickly, here's our services and component architecture has been, as we've been outlining for the last, how long has it been, a year or two? Talking about moving to a service-oriented architecture. Let's go to this slide right here. So I think anybody not familiar with this slide, have we seen this enough that we can move past it, or any questions on that? All right. Just in general, the whole high level, we'll just say this. When looking at technologies like in the .NET space, such as ASP.NET MVC or Web Forms or WebAPI, our preference is to move towards WebAPI and use kind of simple REST type architecture and not have things like Razor syntax or web forms where it commingles the HTML and the C# together. We're trying to get away from that approach and moving to more of a REST-based approach for services. And the reason we want to do that is we want you to be able to write applications that are reusable, whether you have a web implementation for a front end, or I think, as we move to the future, there'll be more and more mobile applications moving into those spaces, and we want to be able to consume your application on a mobile device just as easily as we can on a web-based device. So when we build that way, WebAPI will help us achieve that a lot easier if we avoid those commingling of concerns. So here's a nice little graphic showing the anatomy of a web service implementation. In WebAPI, for instance, there's a controller, and then services are usually backed in another project. At least that's how I divide it up, and repository I also put in another project within the solution. So we'll look at that here in just a minute, but that's just high-level overview of the anatomy. Question, anybody? No? Okay.
What do you mean by repository?
I don't want to talk about that. Repository is a place where you store stuff. So in our case, it's a layer. Yes, Brandon.
I'm curious to know, and you don't have to go into too much detail because it's not the exact topic of this meeting, but I'm curious to know what the advantages of using WebAPI are over other technologies, such as using Node to do your RESTful backends, or Ruby on Rails, or Python, or whatever other language, Java, whatever language there is out there to do it otherwise. Like, what advantages does WebAPI generally have over the others?
Yeah, okay, so the question was, for those on the phone, is what advantages does ASP.NET WebAPI have over other technologies such as Node or Ruby or Java or any of those other implementations for implementing REST over on web services? And there are a few of them. We'll probably touch on them as we get into them today. But honestly, you can implement a REST service in Node, and to the consumer, it should look seamless. That's really the whole point of the design, is that it's seamless. The biggest advantage, obviously, for us as .NET developers is it's on .NET. So if we're comfortable and we like writing in C#, then WebAPI is the baby for us. So that's the biggest advantage. But there's some others. we'll get into those here. So why REST? Well, what is REST, first of all? Today it's what we call the lingua franca of the web. Today it's the popular protocol, I guess. It's not even a protocol. What is REST? It's not a protocol, it's a convention, yeah. That's probably the best description for it. It's a convention for describing URI resources on a web endpoint. So, and typically, resources are represented as plural nouns. So that's a pretty key distinction there. I see a lot of people claim that they're building REST-based web services, and there's verbs like crazy all over in it. And I have to say, that's not really REST, but that's okay. I'm fine with that, and I tend to lean towards pragmatism over dogmatic approach to doing things. So don't force it. If you can't come up with a nice REST-based way to describe something, don't worry about it too much. But some of the keys there are using things like standard HTTP verbs, your get, your put, your post, delete, and there's a handful of others that are a lot less popular, but could be used as well. And then we have something called content negotiation. So the type of content we want to interact with our web API with. Do I want JSON back? Am I going to send you XML? All of those things are decided using content negotiation. Also, it's good to use standard return codes. So when you call the web API, if you're going to return something back to the user, for instance, it's a post and we created an object, you should, instead of posting 200 OK, you should return a 201 created. Or if someone tried to reach one of your endpoints and they're authenticated, but they're not authorized to use that endpoint, instead of sending a 401 back, you should send a 403 back. So that kind of stuff. Use standard return codes. Also, don't do this, and we've made this mistake in the past, right? Where everything comes back as a 200, right? It's a success, and you have to unpackage the contents, the inside, to see that it was actually a failure. Don't do that. Things called, like, I remember we had something for a while called Json Wrap, where we'd wrap every artifact that comes back with a payload and a message and a code. Well, you don't need to do that. The standard HTTP verbs and those return codes are designed to do that for you. So, okay. Finally, use RPC style if REST doesn't fit. Okay, so let's look at some examples real quickly. So here's some REST URI examples. API/customers. And the reason that we have this convention for REST is really, like I said, it's not dogmatic, it's really pragmatic. The idea is if you as a developer are consuming an API, without reading any lengthy documentation, you should be able to look at this and know what you're going to get back. So if I hit API/customers, I would expect an array of customers or a list of customers to come back. On the second one down, customer/25, I would expect to get one customer back whose ID is 25. The third one down, I would get a customer, number 25. I would get all of the games, the Halo 5 games that he played, right, or that are associated with him. And so on and so forth, all the way down to like, well, this one's pretty interesting here. API/customers 33 orders. So customer 33, get his orders between the min date of this and max date of 2/1. So just by looking at that REST URI, you should know what you're going to get. That's the whole point of describing your endpoints using REST, is it's obvious. Okay. Good enough. We won't dig into that too much. So here's some of the verbs. So the other thing that it does is, if you look at this, the resource is /wards. If I call it with a get, I'll get a list of wards. If I post to it, I expect to create a new ward. If I put to it, I expect to update a batch of wards in that case. And if I try to delete wards, I should get an error because I shouldn't be able to delete all wards, right? For a singular item, ward /006521, I can get that individual item. If I try to post to that individual item, it should get an error because it's already created. So I shouldn't be creating that ward again. If I put to it, it'll update it, and if I delete, it'll delete that item. Okay? Close enough. All right, so I was saying use RPC if REST doesn't fit. If a method doesn't map to an HTTP verb, like get and put and post or delete, then it doesn't fit into the RESTful syntax. Don't try to force it. I've seen people go so far out of the way to try to make something look like REST that it just, you lost the whole point of it. The whole point of have it be REST was so that it describes your endpoint clearly so you know what it's doing. So in those cases, don't fight it. That's me speaking here. Don't fight it. If you have an API endpoint that restarts the server, call it restart server. You know, can you imagine trying to describe that in REST? Server / I mean, you could do it, but it might be weird. Okay, content negotiation formats. These are various. There's two headers that we use when we're talking to our web API endpoints. Content type tells the web API endpoint that we're calling what type of data we're sending to it. So if we're doing a post or a put, if we specify a content type of application JSON and we send it XML, the web server will probably respond back with invalid JSON, right? So we tell it what we're sending. Accept tells the web server, this is what I would like back. Now it's pretty soft, okay, that accept is, because if the web server can't return it, it won't. It'll return some default that it can do. So if you ask the web server, say, hey, I'd like this returned back in some weird format, and it doesn't support it, it's going to say, I'm going to give it to you in JSON. So don't be surprised. But those are the accept types. There's a bunch of other types here as well, but those are some of the common ones. Okay, any questions with this so far? Should be pretty easy. Here's some of the common status codes. We don't need to go over all of them, but those are useful. Here's some other ones. Blocks of codes in general. The 200 block means it worked. The 400 block usually means it's a bad request. You did something bad as a consumer. You called my API endpoint. I required you to send something and you didn't send it. That's bad on you. So those are 400s. 500s is you sent me everything that that I needed, but for some reason something blew up on the server side. That's bad on us. So high level, 200, 400, 500. Those are what those are. Okay, development tools. Visual Studio 2015, Entity Framework, all that kind of stuff. Okay, optional browser tools. These are kind of useful. If you use Chrome, the Postman REST client is really helpful when you're building a web API to be able to invoke against those and test it and see what's going on. JSON view is really nice. It makes the JSON that comes back in your browser pretty. It formats it so that it's not all one line, and you can see the hierarchy and the nesting. Firebug, I live and die by that. Firestorage Plus is kind of nice as well. What that does is it lets you look at storage, local browser-side storage, like local session storage and stuff like that. And then Fiddler is another good one. REST client, that's another one. So, okay, time to code. That's enough. Was that too much? If you want to follow along later, you don't have to do it today. Yes?
I had a question that you didn't go over, which is versioning.
Yeah, we didn't talk about versioning.
Is that on purpose?
No, I did. That's another. That's a whole topic unto itself. There's a lot of different techniques for versioning your APIs. Maybe we'll look at that in just a second as we get into some of the code. But that's a good question. Versioning. Okay, so this is on GitHub, and the whole sample project that I'll be working out of is there. What it is if you remember last month when we did Entity Framework, we built up a project that had an Entity Framework connection to a SQL Server database, and loosely the application is an attendance application for these .NET engineering forums. So today we're going to build on top of that and build the web API layer of that project. So if you want to pull this down sometime and look at it and critique it and tell me what I've done wrong, that's awesome. You can do that. So that's where it's at. Mobile Toaster. Okay. So this is cool. Okay, so here's the project where we left off. If you remember last time we had an app.con, an app.data, and an app.services layer. Did we get to services? I don't remember if we got a services layer last time or not. Since then I've added to it, I've added app.core and app.models. And just to kind of show you high level what I did, before app.data had all of the individual models describing the tables or the entities inside of it. I have extracted that and put it in a separate project called models. Anybody have any idea why I would do something crazy like that? Jonathan, what do you think? Yeah, so I could share those models without having to share the data in the repository layer. The whole idea of this, of dividing this architecture up this way, is so that when I do add the WebAPI front end, I don't really want the controllers. I want to kind of loosely enforce, if you will. I want my controller code calling directly back to my database layer, doing things. I want all of those things to pass through my service layer. But sometimes those models that come back need to be available in the Web API layer, as we'll see. So if I split the models apart from the rest of the data layer, I can share those models with the service layer and with the Web API layer without having to actually share the connection to the database. Okay, high level. All right, so let's do this. Here's what we're going to do, and this is the first place where we could go totally belly up, so let's hope this doesn't blow up on us. So I'm going to add a new project to my solution. It's going to be an ASP.NET web application, and I'm going to call it app.web. And there's some other things you may want to uncheck, like add application insights to your project. Definitely don't want that, so I've unchecked it. It already exists. Oh, great.
If you click on the document thing in your Solution Explorer, you can see that hidden directories and delete them that way.
Good point. I don't know why it already exists. Let's see, where is it?
Did everybody get signed up on the roll?
Click on the solution. You can click on it.
I'll just go there. Just delete it. Okay, it doesn't exist anymore. Add new project. Call it app.web. Okay, and I'm going to choose an empty Web API project. And I think that's all I want there. Okay, I have my script I want to follow. Like I said, I'm a little fuzzy, so you'll have to help me here. Even when I was going through and doing this, I was on all kinds of drugs, so who knows what will come out. It should be interesting. Okay, the first thing I want to do is add some references to my other projects. So I'm going to need app.core, I'm going to need app.models and app.services. So we'll go ahead and add those references in, make them available. Let us add a new controller. And I'm going to add an empty Web API 2 controller. And I'm going to call this one the users controller. Okay, so you can see the users controller, it inherits from API controller. And I'm going to create just a simple get. That's not a user. Let's create somebody in here. Okay, so there we go. That's all it takes to get something built. So I'm going to go ahead and build this project. Now, behind the scenes, I've already gone and set up IIS so that it's running, hopefully. We'll see if it works. I'll launch Firefox here. And .NETDev.com is where I put it. And we're going to hit API slash users, call the get, and see if anything happens.
You gotta do /get.
Hmm?
'Cause you're routing.
Shouldn't have to. It should default to that.
Did you configure the router to look at API?
I left it at the default. So it should just be default API slash the name of the controller. So did I
The action would be the default action.
slash users? Okay. I don't know. We're off to a great start. .net-dev.com slash API slash users. Let's try REST client, see what it tells us. It says 404 not found.
You can call it user controller, users controller.
Users controller, so it should be slash users by default. Okay, well this is a good
Did you do user or users
users.
in the URL?
Did I not put users? Yeah, it says users.
Yeah.
Let's make this larger, huh? .netdev.com. Let's just make sure IIS is running. Oh, it stopped. That might be helpful, huh? Oh, great. That's going to be fantastic. All right, forget you. We'll just run it. Oops, wrong. Jeez. We're going to edit all of this out. And this presentation will look flawless when I'm done on video.
Who's not on the roll?
So now we'll have to do everything at localhost. There we go. Now we got a 200 OK back. Content type, application XML. So let's go look and see what we got back. We got an XML node back that says Tony Spencer. So there you go. It's that simple. It's that simple after we cut all that video to make it look simple. Right? All right. Let's see. What else do we want to do here? Let's say that I want to get this back in JSON, right? So I'm going to tell WebAPI that I accept application JSON. Now send that. So now what I get back is, believe it or not, JSON. But because it's a simple string, there's no curly braces or anything like that. So it's kind of boring, but nonetheless, that's how you do that. So let's go back to the code. Let's do something a little more interesting. So the next thing we want to do is, let's put some annotations in here. Oops. So we just called this method get, which is pretty generic, but we can call that method name anything we want that's more descriptive on the C# side. But if we want it to map to a certain endpoint, we can use routes. So I just let the default route that was described in the startup directory, but if I want to be very specific, I can make sure that it maps to that route. And I can restrict the verbs. So in this case, I'm going to put HTTP get on there. So what I've done right there actually didn't impact the application at all. If I were to run it, it'd be the same. What? That's the default, right? So, okay, so let's add a post. Let's do a public HTTP action result. We'll talk about that in a minute. Body, user. Okay, and I'm just going to make this really simple. User dot first. Oh, doesn't know what user user is, does it? That's where we need app.models. So now it knows what the user object is. We'll user.firstname plus we'll append at ldschurch.org onto the end. And we'll just return okay, username. Okay. Let's, so the route's going to be the same. We're going to post to API/users, but it's going to be a post method instead. Yep, I sure do. Thank you. All right. I have to run this again, let it build. This is why it's nice to have real IIS running, but I think I broke that when I deleted the app.web folder. That's all right, whatever. It's going to look perfect on the video, so while that's going, I'm going to get ready to change this to a post. And since I'm going to be posting, I want to post JSON. I'm going to tell the web server the content type is application JSON. Otherwise, it may not know what I'm sending to it. So in this case, I'm not going to fill out the entire user object. I'm just going to keep it simple. And just go first name, and we'll call it Tony. All right, assuming.
No, go ahead.
You guys are so. Thank you. It's going to be perfect on the video. Okay. So we got a response back, was 200 okay, and what we got back was tony@ldschurch.org. So it took that post data, accepted it, automatically mapped it. Notice that they put this little from body in here. When you post something, you can have exactly one object come from the body, and then the rest of, if you need other parameters in here, they have to come from the query string. So in this case, I specified and said, I'm going to be sending, I expect a user object to come in, and that should be coming from the body, not from the query string.
What if you leave from body out, will it still?
What's that?
If you leave from body out, will it still find the body?
You know what? Should we try it? It should work, but I never trust it, so I'm always explicit because, that's how I am. I don't trust. It should work, but who knows?
That's way prettier without it. So.
Oh, you think it's prettier without it? Okay. I think it's pretty with it. I have the beholder, I guess. Takes a while. It's abort. Okay. Yeah, these errors over here are okay. I don't care about them. So, okay, it worked. It said it was fine. So you don't have to put from body there, but I like to. Especially when you get additional parameters there, it's really nice to be able to see which one is coming from the body and which ones are coming from the query string.
Now, if you were passing in a string, perhaps, then it would, I think, then probably assume that it was coming from the URL instead of a... So right here, you're passing in user, which is an object, and so it's automatically saying, oh, it's an object, so I'm going to get it from the body. But I think if you changed it to an int or to a string...
A primitive of some sort. Yeah, if it was a primitive, you'd probably have to specify from body. The objects, it kind of makes that assumption. You're right. Okay, so all that's kind of interesting, but let's hook up to our services, our user service, so we can get some better looking data in here. Controller. So now we have a user service available. Let's add a route here where we can pull back an individual user. So in this case, I'm going to make it part of the URL, user ID. Now, not everything has to go in the URL, and I see people do this sometimes. They kind of say, well, every parameter I need back has to be in the URI, and it doesn't. You can append query strings on for other things. So things like dates and date ranges, those are probably better as query strings, not literally in the URI itself. But user ID, it has this kind of a special relationship with users. So it kind of makes sense to have it in that, in the wrap. Thank you. All right, so we have a route. It's got a lot of extra square brackets. We're attributing our attributes now. And this is just going to be a get. Okay. We'll bring back a single user. I'm going to call this get user by ID. I'm going to pass in the user ID. So in this particular case, it knows to map that user ID in the URI to this incoming parameter here. So if our user equals, we'll call our user service, get user ID. We have a service method that accepts an ID, and we'll just return the user. Okay, any mistakes in that? Let's run that guy. Ship it. Close some of these others. So if this works, I guess I need to pick a user. Let's switch this over here to get API/users, and let's get user 3, whoever that is. I hope we have a user 3. If we don't, this will be a real short trip. Actually, we should get an error. And the error we should get is, hey, you don't have a database. And that's an excellent point. When we added this project, we did not add a connection string to our database in our web config file. So let's go steal that out of the console. App config. So let's grab this connection string here. Put that into our web config. It's like up here somewhere. That's enough. Again. A real short trip to the database if it's not there. This is why I like to set up IIS and not use IIS Express, because I don't have this kind of patience. Okay, so we did get this user object back. Let's look at it like that. User ID 3 looks like it's Michael Gibby. Hey, how about that? Michael Gibby, and there's some information. His password's empty, so that's fine. Password null. Okay, good enough. Is that easy enough? This stuff's all basic, so we'll keep moving. Back to our user controller here. Oh, great. I hate when that happens. Services. Okay. So this was our original get here. I don't like that. I don't think that anytime you call a list for a list of users, you should get a single entity back. So let's connect this now to our users. Oops, lowercase user service get users. Thank you. I'll just call this get users. Now, it's not happy with the return type because it's actually a list of user that's coming back. Okay, and it's actually also not happy because I'm not returning him. That would be helpful too. Okay, so that'll return it. Do you guys trust me that if we ran that, it would bring back a list of users? Okay, good. So, yeah.
So I noticed that some types you're returning objects or lists of objects, and then you have the one type where you're returning an HTTP action result. Why would you return one versus another?
Such a great question. That's number 17 on the list. We'll get to it. So we're almost there. But that's actually, it's a good time to talk about that. It's very nice that you can say return list of user. You can see exactly what you're going to be returning back out of your WebAPI method. But there are times when you want to return those specific action codes or error codes, HTTP codes. In that case, you'd have to return an iHTTP action result. And then they have a bunch of these things like the OKs, createds, and some of those already pre-built for you. And so you can just say return OK, return created, return server error, return whatever, unauthorized, or that kind of thing. So iHTTP action result has a collection of the most common return codes. And you can see in this case, I'm still returning that user back when you do the post, or returning that username back, but it's inside the OK brackets. So in general, high level, more and more, I think, and we will change this in a minute to return an iHTTP action result. But before we do that, for now, I'm just going to leave it as list of user. I'm already tired of using Rust client because I fatigue easily with my sicknesses. So I'm going to cheat, and let's pull in Swagger. Swagger is really, really cool. I think most of you are probably familiar with that. And the way I'm going to do that is pull in a NuGet package called Swashbuckle. So here's Swashbuckle. I'm just going to install that right into my app.web project with all of its glorious dependencies. Okay, so now that it's in there, the other thing we'll do is we should probably put an index.html page just because every time we run, it's going to be awful. So let's just put one in. We'll acquiesce and just say h1 welcome to this page. And then we'll do that later. So let's just run this much. So who is not familiar with Swashbuckle and Swagger? Anybody? Okay, a couple. You're going to love this. So Swagger is a standard metadata descriptor, if you will, for REST APIs. So if I just now type in /Swagger, that NuGet package added a Swagger it's Swagger metadata to my API, describing my API endpoints for me. So it's kind of like it automatically documents my API for me, but it goes even further than that. It allows you to do some things like testing. So you'll notice here we have exactly one controller. If we had multiple controllers here, you'd see a bunch listed. So we have our users controller, and so far we have 3 methods in there. We have 2 gets and a post. And so what it does is it automatically goes, it recurses over your web API application automatically and creates those endpoints and describes them for you. What's really nice about it is if I click on API/users, it even tells me, here's the model that will be coming back, right? If I call this endpoint, you should get back a user object, and here's the model, and here are all their descriptions, their strings and whatnot. And this is what it'll look like if it's in JSON. Well, what will it look like if it's in XML? Probably won't work, but, it doesn't tell me there. Fine, don't tell me. And then you can just click try it out. So So this really speeds development. As you're writing web APIs and stuff, this is just it's such a great help. So here you go, you get a list of users back. So that one I said, trust me on, there you go. So you get some great users. Hey, there's Johnny Depp. Bob Tabor's in there. Brandon Sara. John Worthington. Who else is in here? Jeff Jones, Carlos Herrera, Danny Statton, Tom Maravilla, Jared Roper. Some real famous people. So what's even nicer is on the posts. Remember before I had to kind of handwrite some JSON to send that post in? Well, if you're using Swashbuckle in Swagger, right here it shows that this is the model schema that it expects. If you just click on it, it'll autofill the shape for you, and then you just plug in the values. So it makes it a lot easier and faster when you're creating posts to have that just do all that work for you. So kind of cool. Okay, won't worry about that. Alan.
Do you remove that for production code?
What?
Remove it for production code?
So that's up to you. Depends on what kind of API you're building. In some cases, I leave it in production, where if it's a public API that people can use, but I can hide specific endpoints. That's a little later on at 21, but we can skip ahead and do that now. Let's say I wanted to hide one of those endpoints. Like there's some that will be exposed, but some of them will be secured, and they won't be accessible to the public. So I might keep some wide open. Those I would keep posted in this Swagger metadata, and if you want to go read about the documentation and play with the API or whatever, they can do that. They can invoke it right there. Probably be mostly gets. I wouldn't allow people to do posts or updates through that. But if I wanted to hide one, so let's say I wanted to hide this post, I would hit stop so that I don't get that annoying message. API, what is it? API Explore settings. Ignore API equals true. And have to bring in the namespace for that. So by putting that annotation on a specific, you can put it on a whole controller, you can put it on just a specific method inside that controller, an action in that controller, and it'll hide that from the API.
Can you do conditionally based on the explosion?
Sure. You can do conditionals just using pound if debug.
Okay.
Or you can develop something even better by extending API Explorer attribute yourself, Jonathan. Okay, I'm going to turn that off for right now. All right, where are we next? Let's see. Oh, the other thing you probably noticed while we were doing this is if you're working with a front-end developer like Steve Holland, he's not going to like seeing these models come back. Do you see why? What about these models is he not going to like? Steve, what would you not like about this model?
First letter is capitalized.
Yeah, they're proper case. They're the true form. But JavaScript people don't like it in true form. So there's a simple way to, rather than go and make all of your models look in the non-true form, which would be called Camel Case, and that's because, well, I won't get into that. There's nothing good. If you can't say anything nice, then don't say anything nice at all. So, okay. All right. What we're going to do is we're going to add a config formatter, JSON formatter. And I can never remember this. I have to write this down. I always go back to an old project and look for it. Anybody else do that too? Because this is just not rememberable. Which I don't understand why. I mean, it's pretty obvious. It says what it is. Oh, I messed something up, didn't I? Zero contract resolver equals new Camel Case property names contract resolver. Yeah, right there. So now, if you put that in, it'll automatically convert from your proper case to a C# to Camel Case JavaScript, and vice versa. When he sends you an object that's Camel Cased, it'll know how to match it up with your object on the other side. So that's pretty cool. And we'll look at that in a minute. Believe me that it works. Okay. While we're in here, there is one other thing that's really nice. If you've ever played with WebApi and you published it out to a server and there was a problem, and you call one of the endpoints and you look inside of your console.log in Firefox, you'll get a great message sometimes that says something like, an error occurred, and that's it. No details. Well, that is because when you're in a production or a release mode, it hides all those errors from you. So if you want to see them on your server, you can do this. Include error detail policy dot always, local only, never, whatever. So if you put that include error detail policy, just remember this exists. You don't have to remember how to do it, but when you first publish out there and you hit your first, an error occurred and you're really, really frustrated about it, then you say, wait a minute, I think there's a setting somewhere. And then call me and I'll look it up. Okay. One other thing while we're in here as well, I'm going to enable something called cores. We don't really need it for this example here, but I just wanted to show you how to do it. If you run into cores, a situation where you need it, post. Okay, so this is not going to resolve automatically because in order to make this work, you have to go and add in, it's in a NuGet package. So let's go out to NuGet. Okay. Web API dot cores, I think. There it is. So if you install that NuGet package, then you resolve it, accept a whole bunch of stuff, send them your credit card, then you can resolve this. Okay, so there's cores enabled there. Okay, so that's just if you happen to deal with cores. If you don't know what it is, you don't have to deal with it, then that's great. But if you do, this is where you would enable that, is here. Right now I've enabled it, cross-origin resource sharing for all domains, origin and destination likewise. Okay, that's where it is, that's where you do it. So this is some of the configuration stuff. Okay, let's change this to an IHTTP action result. Yeah?
You need to add that cores to the config? Does it automatically just set
Because of the way I set that up, no, you don't have to. It's just, it's star.star. You just put it in there and that should turn it on for you. Now, there are a lot of other options with cores. If you want to just secure certain controllers or certain endpoints, say, my application won't respond to requests from another origin, except for this endpoint right here, get weather, then I'll make that one wide open. You can see that it's called enable cores attribute. It's actually an attribute. So you just annotate that method and put your cores information in that, just over that top. This is really high level. I don't want to dig deep into it, but that's roughly, it's the same mechanism. Okay, so I've changed this to return a action result. I'm trying to quickly get through some of this stuff here. So the downside to this is if I have an IHTTP action result as my return type, my Swagger metadata will no longer give me what my return type is. So that kind of screws up Swagger. That stinks. Well, how do we get around that? We annotate it. Oops. You have to say type of list of user. So if you annotate it, that will tell Swagger what the actual return type is that you expect, and then you'll get that model back in your schema, and it looks all fancy and happy days. So these are good little tips to know. All right, what else here? Any questions to this point? I know I'm kind of just flying through some of this stuff and slow at the same time. I wanted to pull in a CSV media type formatter. So one of the cool things, so here's one of the advantages that I really like about .NET's Web API project. It's built very modularized, and those formatters, so we added that one that's called the Camel Case formatter for JSON. You can extend that, create your own formatters, add new formatters, and support lots of different types. Today, JSON is all the rage, but tomorrow, we'll learn that JSON is horrible because that was last week. We don't do that anymore. We use the next great thing, whatever it is. So there are some new types that are coming down, such as BSON, binary JSON. There's some advantages to using that. It's some smaller payloads. There's maybe faster serialization and deserialization. I don't know what the real benefits of BSON is, but if in the future we could extend our Web API project without changing anything to support BSON, and we wouldn't add any new methods in there, it would just do content negotiation and says, oh, the user wants it in BSON. I have a formatter for that. Get users, I'm going to return that to you as a list of BSON instead of JSON or XML. So let me see if I can find this real quick. I do have the CSV media type formatter, which I wrote. I'm going to add a new folder. Call it formatters. Paste this in here. Go ahead and include that in the project. So if you look inside of here, it inherits from media type formatter, and it implements a few different things in here. And we won't dig into this, but this is in the repo. If you pull it down, you can look through it and see what it's doing. It satisfies the requirements of the formatter, and what it will do is it'll take any IEnumerable, and it will return it as a comma delimited list of values, so a CSV format. So in praxis, I don't know how I did that, but that's cool. I do need to go and add it as a formatter type. So I'll go back into my Web API config. Formatters dot, let's see, is it add? I think it's just add. I think it's just new CSV media type formatter. I think that's all you have to do. Of course, resolve the namespace. App.web.formatters. Okay, so let's run it. We haven't run for a while. Let that build. So if you looked in the code for CSV media type formatter, what's really cool is you can do content negotiation, right? In the header, you could say, I accept CSV types. In other words, that's what I want from you, web server. I'm going to ask you for a list of users, but I want it in an Excel format or a CSV type format. So give that to me. And if the web server has that format or type, it'll say, yeah, I can do that. I'll give it to you. There's some limitations on that. Obviously, it has to be a list of something that it returns, or an IEnumerable. So if I hit refresh, if it's just a single user, it won't be able to return it as a list of users. Okay, so you'll notice in Swagger, it added text/CSV as a type. Another way that we can put it in the header in REST client. So let's say I'm going to go over here and get a list of users now. But instead of putting it, here's what I'm going to do. I've created it so that it will also look at the query string that says if user has put a query string format equals CSV on there, it'll respond to that and it'll return it as a list of comma delimited values. The benefit to doing that is sometimes on your web page, you want to be able to have a link that they can click that says download this report as an Excel file. So you'll notice that it pulls it down as an Excel file, opens it up, and voila, we have a list of users in here. and their birth dates and their passwords and everything that's in there. So it's that simple. I didn't write any new code to say specifically put a method in there that says get users by return Excel. I just put a content formatter in there, and then then it just does it. It's pretty magical. Any questions on that? Some pretty cool stuff. I know we're getting up against it. 2:05. What do you want to do, Jim?
Somebody in the chat had asked if you could post that GitHub URL at the end.
I'll post it at the end so they can see that. And there's some branches in there. WebAPI 3 branch is the most complete at this point. So if you go and grab that, that'll be cool. There's some other things that we didn't really quite get to. I know it takes so long to do this stuff. I'm sorry. I don't get through these faster, but there's a whole section on security that I wanted to look at as well. How do you secure your endpoints, right? And I have a simple way to do that. You can. It's basically as simple as just putting an auth attribute on top of that endpoint and requiring some type of security. Now the trick is this. What does that mean to secure a web API endpoint, right? Secure it to, from whom? In the case of a SPA application, like an Angular app, a user needs to log into the website to access the web API endpoints, right? So in that particular instance, that is a client, server type of scenario. So there will be a challenge and response. Jonathan will log in at a web page. He'll type in his credentials. I'll pass it into my thing and we'll authenticate him as a user. When it's done, I'm going to send him back a token, probably in what they call a JOP format, a JSON web token, back to his browser. And then every subsequent request that comes into me, he'll pass that token in the header, okay? And then my auth annotation on top of the web API endpoint, on every single request in the pipeline, it will open that up and it will look at that authorization header and it'll look at that token and unpackage it to make sure it's valid and not tampered with and say, yep, this is Jonathan, and yep, Jonathan has rights to use this, let him through. So there's a gatekeeper that sits in front before you even hit these endpoints here. It passes through that handler and takes care of that. But there are other scenarios as well. If you wanted to expose this application to an application that Rich Haddock is writing that's probably just really amazing, that he needs to mine some data from this site, I can set up an API to API gateway credential for him. So he doesn't have to log in. It would be silly to make his application authenticate to mine using a username and a password and have to go to a web page. That's not going to work for him. His page needs to be able to contact mine directly. And if he just passes in a pre-shared key or credential between us, I'll know it's him. I'll know it's coming from a certain IP address, possibly, if I cared, if I needed that level of security. And then through that same request handler pipeline, I will open that up, look at it, and say, yep, this is a valid token. It's Rich's token. He is who he says he is. He can access these parts of my API. And so we don't have time to dig into that, but I do have those samples out there, and you'll see it under auth attribute, where I've literally written the code. We can pull it up here real quick, but so here's a auth attribute. We'll pull this up in VS Code. No, we won't. We'll pull it up in a new instance of Visual Studio because that makes more sense. Great. Sorry about that. This is going to be great on video, though, because we're going to cut all this stuff out. No, it's going to suck because I have to edit it. Huh? Oh, yeah. Yeah, don't wait for the recording because we need you here to correct us so that the recording's so much better. Again, I apologize. I wish I was healthier. So you can see this is the code that we're using a filter attribute. It inherits from authorization filter attribute, and it overrides the on-authorization method, and it pulls apart the request headers, looks in the authorization header for bearer. In this case, it's looking for a bearer token, and then opens it all up, validates it, makes sure it's real. And if it's real, it populates the current principal. And so that's available in all the controllers. And David had to leave, but we had this discussion yesterday a little bit, discussing if you looked inside of a project that he's inherited, inside of every WebAPI method, they go out there and they reparse all of the WAM headers, bring in the user. In every single method, he's got that code like multiple times all over the place. It would be better to put it in a single authorization attribute like this, and then put all of that logic in one spot. And then this will get executed in the pipeline on every single request. And only if your method is annotated with your auth attribute will it actually care. If it's not annotated with that, it's going to skip this code altogether. One other thing we didn't quite get to was the config message handler for request trace handling. Yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
Is there a way to make this just automatic, like to do this same authentication stuff, but instead of having to put on the attribute on every single thing that I make, just make it global?
You could make it global in that the question was, could I just make this global so I wouldn't have to annotate every method inside of my controllers with this attribute, if you needed that. Well, you can put it in different scopes. You can put it on the whole controller at the top of the controller, and it'll work there. Or in the config, you could set it up so that it would apply to every request coming in. Typically, you don't do that because I've never seen an application where you could actually get away with that, because usually you have a credentials. You need to authenticate the user. Well, that can't be secured with requiring them to be logged in, right? So that doesn't work real well. You can do it that way, and you could actually do the inverse.
Yeah, just have one attribute that says non-authenticated,
yes.
and that just bypasses the other authentication.
Yeah, so you can do that. That is an option. You could just annotate it with, I don't remember what the annotation is, but the inverse logic of that. Everything is secure except this and this. Yeah. And I don't remember the exact syntax because I don't use that very often, but it's there and it is available. So, were there other questions on the chat? No? Okay. But the last thing was the request trace handler. Sometimes when you're using Web API and you're trying to troubleshoot something, someone's trying to hit your Web API and they're saying, I'm calling it, but nothing's happening. And you look through your logs and I can't see that you're calling me, so there's this disconnect. Because what it tries to do is it looks through your list of all of your endpoints, and let's say that they're calling in, and instead of API/users, the user typed API/user. Yeah, I'm calling it, right? I keep getting a 404. Why am I getting a 404? Well, you're not going to see that on your side because he never made it to any of your controllers, right? So even if you had logging turned on, it would never make it there. So there's some sample code I have on there that's called a request trace handler. What it does is it injects itself early in the pipeline. And any incoming request hits it very, very first. So before it goes through Web API's engine to try to do any routing or try to do any mapping of objects and serialization and deserialization, all the magic that it does under the hood for you, you can intercept that very, very early in the call to see what's coming in and log it there. And so I have some of that sample code we won't dig into today because our hour has come and gone already. Holy cow. It just flies by. So, but it'll be there in that it's in the project. So, any other questions anybody has about Web API or anything at all? Jim?
You keep going. As long as people sit in the room, we're recording. So,
Rich?
Did you implement this in Asp Net Core 1.0?
Not yet. Every time I do that, something changes. So I'm really kind of ornery about that. Did I implement? Oh, the question was, have I tried implementing this in ASP.NET Core 1.0 yet? No.
I actually did try doing a very simple Web API in Core the other day on Ubuntu.
Oh.
And it works pretty well.
Does it? Awesome.
And not only that, you don't have to use Mono to run it, because Microsoft now provides what they call DNVM, which is basically the same concept of NVM or RVM or PVM or RV, ENV, and all that kind of stuff, the package managers, or the managers for the versions of your environment. And so you can use that to install whatever version of Core you need on Linux, and they have one natively supported for Linux, and they also have a tutorial that I just followed, you know, line for line online that tells you how to set it all up with MVC6
Awesome.
and stuff. So
Yeah, so there's some great advantages to the ASP.NET Core. One of them is performance. For starters, they've really put a great deal of effort into performance, and so I think I even read some places where they were outperforming Node on the same server, which was surprising. But you know, I'm sure it's a very controlled test. As long as it always returns Tony Spencer as a string, it just flat out beat Node. You know, I don't know, but I think it's interesting that they're even caring enough about performance though to try to get it there, and I think that's cool. The other big advantage is it's very modularized. Everything, you know, everything you want, you have to pull it in and add it to your package.
you'll also have to get very used to a new project structure.
Yes.
Because they're using NuGet 3 with the package, with the JSON formatting instead of, you know,
Yes.
your NuGet 2, you know, XML formatting and stuff like that. Basically, if you're familiar with NPM, then you'll be fine. Because they're pretty much just ripping off NPM and how they did stuff because it's so popular.
Right.
So,
It's awesome stuff. It's anyway, we hope to move to that at some point in the near future when things settle just a bit. It's not bad. I mean, you can build projects on it today and go if you want. Just be prepared for maybe a little bit of churn. It's pretty close. They're release candidate 2, almost 3, I guess. But they're still actually changing some things, which is a little disturbing for a release candidate. But it is what it is. But it'll be great when it gets here. So that is for ASP.NET Core. Yes, that was the question, right? I saw that. I actually saw that come up. Okay, well, we'll wrap up here. The last thing I want to do is just, I'll put up the URL. Well, let's put that up right now. People were asking about, here's the GitHub URL. It's github.com. Mobile Toaster, that's me, that's my user name. And then the application is .NET Engineering Forums, DNE Forums. So, what's that?
We think that says Tonster.
Tonster? Yeah, it says Mobile Tonster. That makes sense. And the last thing I was going to show you is I've started working on a new series called Kodak Moments. And what these are really short little clips, intended to only be 2 to 3 minutes long, kind of along the same theme. If anybody is familiar with King of Random on YouTube, anybody watch King of Random? He's a local guy down here somewhere, but he's got hundreds of videos on little projects, and he's very, very concise about them. He can create a project. It's MacGyver all over again, but he says, today I'll show you how to make a such and such out of some baling twine and gum wrappers and some duct tape. He does use a lot of duct tape, by the way. So anyway, they're really cool and they're really concise. So this was the first Kodak moment, and we'll leave this with you as we depart. On this edition of Code Hack Moments, we look at web config transformations in ASP.NET. Sometimes you need to modify values of your web config file in your ASP.NET projects depending upon which environment you want to deploy to, or a certain build configuration. ASP.NET provides a transformation engine to create custom web config files based upon target environment and build configurations. Let's take a look at how this works. If we examine a typical default ASP.NET project, we'll find a web config file with 2 transform templates beneath them, one for debug and one for release. Other configs can be added via the configuration manager. Inside the transform templates, you'll find code that has been commented out. The transform template contains instructions for locating and transforming nodes in the web config source file, which will create a new web config file with merged output. The definition requires two parts, a search or a locator component, and a transform component. These components are expressed as XML attributes. First, let's examine the locator attribute. Locator supports three attribute types: condition, XPath, and match. We will only worry about the most common locator, match. To learn more about the other locators, please click the included link to get detailed information about their syntax. The match locator accepts a comma-delimited list of attribute names. The match locator will identify a matching node based upon the value of the name attribute. The transform engine will locate a matching XML node in the web config file with a name of default DB. Next, let's examine the transform attributes. There are 8 possible transform types. Let's look at 2 of the most common: replace and set attributes. Using our previous example from the match locator, once our match has been found, the replace transform will replace the entire node and attributes with the new version found in the web.debug.config file or other transform file. In our example, if we change the transform to use set attributes, only the value found in the connection string attribute will be replaced, not the entire node. In this case, the new value of connection string will be new string. Finally, we can preview the merged web config by using the Preview Transform option by right-clicking on the web config file that we want and choosing Preview Transform. This will generate a side-by-side comparison of the original config and the transformed config. And that's it for this code hack moment. Thanks for watching.